this video we're going to be looking at the SUMIF and COUNTIF family of formulas. These are particularly useful formulas for finding a filtered result in terms of a sum or a count of a particular category within your list of data. SUMIFs effectively allow us to perform filtered operations where we apply conditions upon how we sum or count a given range. Let's jump straight in with an example and have a look at how we might use a SUMIF formula to find the total sales made by Jones. I type my equals to start the formula, type SUMIF, and tab to autocomplete the formula. Within the SUMIF we have three parameters. First of all, the range, which more aptly would be called the criteria range. The second parameter, which is the criteria against which we're going to filter our list or our calculation. And finally, the sum range. The sum range is going to be the thing that we want to evaluate. So in my example here, I'm looking for the total sales made by Jones. In this context, the criteria range, or this first range here, will be column B, which contains the sales rep name. So I'm going to check the sales rep column against a particular sales rep, in this case Jones. Jones will be entered into my criteria. And then finally, I need the sum range. What am I going to actually evaluate? What am I going to sum in this case? That is going to be column G, where I find my total sales. Let's go ahead and put my formula together. I'm going to start by clicking in the first cell of my sales rep column, holding Control Shift and down arrow to the bottom of my column. From here I can type my comma and move on to the second parameter. I could use a cell reference here and point at a cell that contains the word Jones, but in this case I'm just going to type it directly into the formula. Opening my speech marks because it's a text value, type Jones and close the speech marks. My final parameter is, as discussed, the sum range, in this case column G. I'm going to select the first cell, hold Control Shift down to the bottom of that column. I've now finished my formula. I can close the brackets off and hit enter. So our result has been evaluated as 2786.55. Let's just double check that that calculation is correct. So let's use a manual filter to check how many sales have been made by Jones. I need to unselect all the other sales reps, find Jones and click OK. From here I can now simply highlight the total sales column, and at the bottom of the screen in my status bar area I'm going to have the result, which comes out at 2786.55. We can't double check it against the result because it's hidden by the filters, but let me just take that filter off, and sure enough there's that value. The next formula to look at is COUNTIF. COUNTIF works in a very similar way to SUMIF, but it performs a count rather than a sum. So actually it's a more straightforward formula with less parameters. Again, probably the best way to explain this is jumping straight into an example. I'll start my formula by pressing the equals. From here I type COUNTIF. And here I just have two parameters. First of all, the range which against I'm going to test. Again, it could be more aptly renamed as criteria range. And in this case, we want to test for the number of sales made by Jones. So we just want to count how many sales Jones has made. I'll start by clicking on the first cell of my sales rep column, holding Control Shift down to the end of the column. And now I can move on to the second parameter, the criteria. I can enter a fixed text value like we did before and just type in the word Jones, or I can make it a reference to another cell. Let's try that. So here I'm just going to point at this cell here in column I. There's currently nothing in that cell, but I'm about to fill it in with some text in just a second. So I hit enter to exit my formula, and now I can go into cell I and type the word Jones. My COUNTIF formula has now evaluated against the cell reference that I pointed in. This does now give me the flexibility that if I wanted to do the count calculation for a different salesperson, for example Gil, all I have to do is type a different name into that cell, rather than rewriting my slightly more complicated COUNTIF formula. However, if you are going to use dependent cell references like this to affect the calculation of a formula, it is best to highlight in some way that that cell is editable. That cell affects the result of another cell. I could, for example, simply color this cell using cell styles or just some straightforward formatting. Let's say I use this standard cell style called the input cell. Anyone familiar with cell styles will now know that this color scheme here refers to the cell style input, and will know that therefore we are talking about an input cell style. The actual cell style or formatting that is used is actually up to you. My advice would be pick a cell style scheme and stick to it. Once you decide on a color combination of background and font, stick with it throughout the rest of your workbook, and if you can, stick with it on any workbook that you use. If you're working for a large organization, you may find that within your department there's already some precedence about what color schemes people use for inputs and outputs.